Romans chapter 11. Hear the word of the Lord. I asked then, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah? How he appeals to God against Israel. Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have demolished your altars. And I alone am left. And they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it's no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now, I'm speaking to you Gentiles, and as much then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order that somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Well, that's true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue with their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? Lest you be wise in your own sight, I want you to understand this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too now have been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. Oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Or who has given a gift to him, that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, is ethnic pride wrong? Now, pride as in I feel good about, I'm not ashamed of, I'm proud of my child's grades. Now, I'm proud of my country, I'm my people. Is that wrong? Is it wrong to feel good about your ethnicity or nation? We just had the 4th of July in which we celebrate our country. You may have noticed that we didn't do that here. We had no flag. We have no patriotic songs. That's because we're Reformed. It's part of what it means to be Reformed, by the way. Is it okay to do that outside of church? Well, Americans may be patriotic, but we have a very uncomfortable time feeling proud of our ethnic group, whatever it may be, one's ethnic group, because we are a nation that's not based on ethnicity. In some other nations, you can get citizenship automatically if you share their race. But in the U.S., we are supposed to be united by ideas or by ideals rather than by ethnicity. And so the motto included in the first American seal established in 1782 had the words in Latin, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. We were one nation created out of people from many other nations. Now, sure, we can allow some ethnic groups to celebrate their own heritage. The Irish Americans have St. Patrick's Day, and a lot of people wear green even if they're not Irish. Or the Italian Americans like to celebrate Columbus Day. We can have special times like now, lately, Juneteenth, to remember the experiences of certain groups, like African Americans. We can still be one, we think, but allow for many of different kinds to be proud of their uniqueness. Of course, some other Americans, usually people in the majority, dislike all these ethnic identities, saying, you shouldn't feel proud of your ethnicity. Forget all of that. Just be plain American. Likely they don't know what it's like to be a minority. I lived in Singapore for 5 years where I was, calling it a minority is an exaggeration. It was like, there's hardly anyone like me at that time anyway. But when I was there, I wanted to be reminded of my nation, especially in the first couple of years. I wanted to be reminded of who I am, my people. And so I celebrated July 4th and Thanksgiving, even though no one around me was. Thanksgiving meant going to Denny's and getting a turkey sandwich. It's the best you could do. I listened, before the internet, I listened to the Voice of America on shortwave radio. I'd eat at McDonald's and KFC. Look forward every week to my favorite TV show, at least at that time, America's Funniest Home Videos. It was on TV there in Singapore, and I so loved that half hour. It reminded me of home. Now, the majority there is Chinese, and like majorities almost everywhere, they assume that their way is the way. They don't think we do things Chinese way. They think this is just the way people do things. Right? I once spoke with a Chinese Singaporean there who was planning on coming to America to study, and I told him, you may, once you're here in America, you may want to find a Chinese church and you'll feel comfortable there. And he responded, oh, that's not necessary. I'll feel just as comfortable with the Americans. And I looked at him and didn't say anything, but I looked at him and thought, oh, you'll see. You'll see. You'll crave the familiarity of your culture. Once you're a fish out of water, you'll crave to be back with your familiar. You'll crave chopsticks and hearing Mandarin, Chinese food, people taking their shoes off at the door like civilized people do. Familiar ways. You don't realize, I was looking at him, you don't realize how Chinese you really are. I knew that because I didn't realize how American I really was until I left America. Now here we see Paul deal with, among other things, ethnic pride. A pride he was familiar with because he shared it himself. A good kind of ethnic pride. Now if any group of people have something to be proud of, it's the Jews. Now sure, the Americans have their Declaration of Independence and their values of liberty and justice. They're our own, fighting for freedom in both world wars. And the Chinese have their long history. They have the wisdom of Confucius and the Great Wall and inventions like gunpowder and the compass and paper and printing, and many other nations have all kinds of things they can be proud of. But of all of that, no matter what any other nation can be proud of, all of that pales into comparison to what Israel can be proud of, what they can boast of. They have the fact that God chose them, revealed himself to their forefathers, basically God founded them, led them powerfully out of Egypt, gave them the law, spoke to them through prophets, raised up a king, David, to rule for God himself. Now that's something you can really be proud of. They regularly pray, this is a traditional Jewish prayer, "Blessed are you, King of the universe, for not having made me a Gentile." Paul deals with that in our place in God's people in this chapter in three parts. First, the remnant, then the tree, and then finally the mystery. Well, first, the remnant, the leftovers. Earlier in Romans, he's he's shown that being right with God comes through faith, not through works, and not through ancestry. And he said in Romans chapter 2, verse 28, for no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly. And he picked that idea up again, starting with chapter 9, where he said in verse 6, not all who are from Israel are of Israel. Now, if you assume, there's one very prominent evangelical preacher today that says, Israel always means Israel. It's just the ethnic group, that's what it always means. Well, if you assume that's what it always refers, the word Israel always refers to the little ethnic group, like assuming that the law always means the law of Moses. Think how confused that would make you going through Romans. Or the flesh always means the body. That statement, not all who are from Israel are of Israel, sounds very strange. That wouldn't make any sense, would it? It would be like saying, no one is Polish who is merely one outwardly. What? Or not all who are from Japan are of Japan. Well, sure you are. If that's your ethnicity, that's where your parents, your ancestors are from, that is what you are. You inherit your ethnicity. You're just born into it. Indeed, the modern Israeli right of return states just that in law. Any person with Jewish ancestry, that's either parent or even just a grandparent, who is Jewish, is considered Jewish, and therefore has a right, by law, to immigrate to Israel. So if you have any Jewish ancestry, any grandparent, you can just show up at Israel, say, I'm a citizen, let me move in. The modern Israeli law says that one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly. All who are from Israel, according to them, are of Israel. Well, the inspired apostle Paul says, no. Being one of God's people, that's who the true Israel is, who inherit the promises given to Abraham, does not depend on being literally born from Abraham. You don't have to have any descendant from Abraham among your grandparents or anywhere in your ancestry. Your physical ethnicity does not make you one of God's people. What matters is faith. Now, if that's the case, then, to begin chapter 11, has God rejected his people, meaning the Israelites? He answers again emphatically, absolutely not. Some outward Jews, some of those from Israel are indeed of Israel. As Paul shows in 4 proofs. First, the personal. In verse 1, look at me. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham. But God has saved me. I am one believer out of the many, most of whom are not believers. Well, second, the theological in verse 2, God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Now, this should immediately remind us of the last time that Paul used the term, the word foreknow, when he spoke of God foreknowing in Romans chapter 8, verse 29. For those whom he foreknew, whom he decided beforehand to have a relationship with, those he predestined, he called, he justified, and glorified. They are God's elect, whom no one can condemn. It is as good as done. And so here has God rejected every literal Israelite, every ethnic Jew? No. There's me, and there's still others from among them whom he has foreknown, the elect. Third, the biblical. Some think the Old Testament is just for Israel, just for the literal Jews. But even the Old Testament shows us that not all who are from Israel are really of Israel, are really God's people. In verse 2, in Elijah's time, most of Israel was persecuting God's true people, the true Israel. They were killing the prophets, they were demolishing God's altars, and Elijah, at least he felt so alone that he thought he was the only one left of God's true people. But the Lord said that he's kept for himself 7,000 men. Those were the faithful few. That was the remnant. That faithful few, the remnant, was the true Israel. Fourth, the partial. In verse 5, just as in Elijah's day, so too, Paul says, so too, at the present time, right now, there is a remnant. So that principle still continues. There's a small number of faithful few left. The question is, has God rejected his people? No. There is a part of Israel who are really his people, who are the true Israel. They are not rejected, but it's only partial. He's kept a remnant in Israel, and now, who are his people, and they are chosen by grace. In verse 6, he reminds us what grace is. If it's by grace, it's not by works. Grace has to be by itself. It's unearned, or it's not grace. Verse 6, that's kind of an important point, because some people have been teaching the past 2,000 years that sure, salvation is by grace, but you got to do stuff to get the grace. And we, the church, we have the stuff you got to do to get the grace. So you better be good to us or we won't give you the stuff to get the grace. And it works like that. So pay up so you can get grace. Well, that's not grace if you have to do stuff to get it. Understand? So God has not rejected all of Israel, Paul's own ethnic group that he feels rightly proud of, that he has such sympathy and love for. But they are not, contrary to what they think and are so wrongly proud of, right with God simply because they are Israelites. Now, sure, some of them are saved. That's the remnant. But it's not because they are Israelites. It's only because of God's grace. So then, in verse 7, echoing back to this question in chapter 9, verse 30, which is really has been dealing with from end of chapter 9 all the way through chapter 10 and now into chapter 11. Israel was seeking to be right with God, but they haven't gotten it. They haven't gotten righteousness. Why? And these Gentiles were not seeking it, and they did get it. Why? Now, sure, a few within Israel, the remnant, the elect, they got it, but the rest of Israel were hardened. The reason the majority of the Israelites did not accept that Jesus was the Messiah was because, in verse 8, God, notice he's in charge, he's still the potter, making vessels for honorable or dishonorable use. God gave them a spirit of stupor, like they were asleep, unable to see and understand. God gave them eyes that they would not see and ears that they would not hear, down to this very day. Paul wrote this about 55 AD. It's still just as true today in 2022. And then condemnation, the sentence against them, that they would be trapped, they would stumble, they are blinded, they're enslaved for those who don't believe. But there is still a remnant out of Israel that God is calling some of them. Next, second, we see the tree, an olive tree, in verses 11 to 24. He has said that Israel, most of the Jews, have stumbled at the word of Christ. Remember, the faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. Most of these Israelites have stumbled over it. That this preaching that being right with God is through believing in Jesus, that's offensive to them. And so they reject the message. And so at verse 11, have they completely fallen? No more to be considered. They're just done with it. It's over for them. Again, he says absolutely not. But because they didn't accept Jesus, the word of Christ has gone out to the non-Jews. Like a course of water hits an obstacle where it can't go, it's channeled in a different direction. And here it's channeled away from the Jews to other people. So God used the sin of Israel, their hardening, to bring salvation to those in other ethnic groups, to people like us. You see, for most of the early Christians, this was a total surprise. For us, we're talking back on this. Paul, why are you so, almost like he's belaboring the point to us. And we're thinking, why are you so surprised by this? Like it's new to you. Well, to them it was surprising. It was shocking. They expected the Jews to happily accept the news that Jesus was the Messiah, that he died for their sins, that he rose again, that he's their king, and to accept that and to believe in him. But time after time, even though a few Jews would believe, like Paul, of course Paul was called by Jesus himself. That's what it took to get through to him. You know, that Damascus Road appointment. But a few Jews would believe, sure, but most rejected the word of Christ. And so Christians then took the word. They're getting a hard time from the Jews. They take the word out to the non-Jews, to the Greeks and the Romans, the Arabs, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, whoever else was around. And many of them accepted it. If it had not been for the rejection of the gospel by the Jews, if you're getting a good response from them, you just stick with them. But they weren't getting a good response. If that hadn't happened, they may never have considered taking the gospel to those other people. And so God used the rough reception that the early Christians got in synagogues from Jewish officials to steer them out to the world, to people like our ancestors. Because it was from them, understand, he is a people in all kinds of people. And he's sending out messengers to get his people spread in all kinds of nations. And so he says in verse 12, their trespass, that's the Israelites, the Jews' trespass, the sin of the Jews in rejecting the gospel, has meant riches for the world. That is for the non-Jewish people. Because we are getting the gospel as a result of them rejecting the gospel. And so he says, if we're getting rich by their failure, how much better will it be for us and for them if one day they stop resisting? Not as though he'll take it from us. The Jews start responding, we'll give up on these people. No, not as we'll stop it. It'll be better for all of us. How much better will it be if they stop resisting, if they accept Jesus as the Messiah? It's an exclamation in verse 12. Notice that in verse 12. How much more? How much greater will it be? If it's good now for us, if it's riches now for us, how much better will it be for us when the Jews are included? When they get their, literally it says fullness. They get their fullness. How much better? How much greater will that be? And so even though Paul is, as he says here, the apostle to the Gentiles, in verse 13. So that's his calling from God, to take it to the Gentiles. But still, he cares for his own people. He has the good kind of ethnic pride. He wants to see his people saved too. And so he magnifies, that is, he makes much of. Magnifying glasses make something appear bigger. He makes his ministry appear bigger in hopes that if the Jews see non-Jews, people like you and me, coming to God, coming to the Lord, enjoying the blessings of God, the benefits of the covenant, they thought were just for them. And now they see these other people, these formerly pagan people getting it. Well, then they'll get jealous and more of them will be saved. Will come to the Lord. So maybe this is right. Maybe this is true. If they see it lived out by these non-Jewish people. Because in verse 15, because of their rejection of the gospel means reconciliation of the world. Their rejection means reconciliation of the world. Now, world here doesn't mean all people everywhere. It means people from all kinds of different nations. It doesn't mean all people. It means all peoples. You know what I mean? All kinds, every ethnic group, not every individual. People from all kinds of different nations out of every ethnic group are now being put in a good relationship with God. They're being reconciled. Now, formerly pagan people, most of our ancestors were pagan people, non-Jewish, sinful people. If they're now being reconciled with God, they're coming into a good relationship with God. What then will it mean when the fullness, the full number of Jews, they too finally accept Jesus as the Messiah? Well, that, he says, that'll be a glorious day. That'll be like the resurrection, like life from the dead. Probably implying that it will come closer to that time of the resurrection. There is still he calls it a full number of them waiting to be brought in. Otherwise, God has a quota. Although it's a particular individuals. It's not just anyone can come once you get to a certain number. He has certain people he has called. And in the meantime, we should not use the rejection, their rejection of the gospel as an excuse to reject them and to treat them like animals, like some people have. Even though only some of them are truly holy, selected by God, like a pinch of dough in verse 16, offered as a sacrifice. He's talking here about the sacrifices in the Old Testament. A pinch of dough, if you're going to offer it as a sacrifice, the whole lump that it comes from needs to be holy, needs to be set aside and special. If the root, like Abraham and David, is holy, so are the branches. It means that God will still draw people from them, out of them, and many other ethnic groups. God is making one people. And that's pictured here as a tree, an olive tree, in verse 17. And that's kind of important, is that there's one tree. Notice, there's one tree in verse 17. Not trees. He's not planting a grove. He has one tree representing the people of God. So there's not different trees. There's not one Jewish tree and a non-Jewish tree. Certainly not a white believer's tree and a black believer's tree and a Chinese believer's tree. No, there's just one tree. May have different branches, but they're all attached to the same trunk and the same roots, get the same sap. Now, some of the natural branches were broken off. Natural is an interesting word. Natural branches. That's the branches that thought they deserved to be part of the tree, that were originally part, that were cultivated as part of that tree. That it's in their nature, they think, and just because they were born into the right ethnic group, and so they were proud of their attachment to the tree. But and they were indeed over history, over time, cultivated to be part of that tree. That's where they're from. But the problem is they thought it was there just by birthright. They kind of deserved it just by being born into it. But they are cut off now. And others from other cultures, from other trees, wild trees, not cultivated, not influenced by the Word of God. They are grafted into this one tree. That is now formerly pagan peoples, like from us. And we still probably have more pagan influence than we're aware of. That's why we need to be transformed. We'll get into chapter 12. But now these formerly pagan peoples from all kinds of other ethnic groups, like from Americans or Europeans, Africans, Chinese, are being attached to this tree. And now they're absorbing the nourishment of the sap. And so out of many is being made one lively, it's diverse, many different kinds of branches, but united tree. Now, why were the natural branches cut off? Is it because God doesn't like Jews anymore? Like the anti-Semites and Nazis and people like them think? No, that is the arrogance toward the natural branches that Paul tells us not to have in verse 18. Don't do that. Don't be anti-Semitic. Don't look down on them as though that they are inferior, they're despicable. Don't do that. Don't do that for 3 reasons, he says here. First, consider the root of our faith. That it is Abraham and David and the rest of the Old Testament. It's the promises to them that saved us. The promises that saved us come from them. And so now we are attached to them. So remember, it's one tree, and that tree, you want to give it a name? It's called Israel. And so now, if we're part of the tree, we are part of Israel. So their history is our history. That's why a lot of time in churches, we spend a lot of time learning the history of Israel. Because now it's our history. And you're going to be anti-Semitic? That doesn't make any sense, does it? Because now you're part of that tree. Well, second, that we stand by grace, which is the greatest antidote to pride. And third, consider God's character, His kindness and sternness, His gentleness and severity. Realize that if God cut off from His people those who were raised in believing the covenant promises, pursuing righteousness by keeping the law, raised in the law, if He cut them off, how much more easily can He cut you off? And so He says in verse 30, stand in awe. In verse 20, stand in awe. So why have the old natural branches been cut off? Because, he says in verse 20, unbelief. They didn't believe God because they believed in themselves. And that's what pride is. It's the definition of pride. Belief in yourself. And they particularly had ethnic pride. They didn't understand that they needed grace to stand before God. They didn't understand the God they were dealing with. That He was both kind and stern. Both merciful and severe. Now people today, they like only to think about part of who God is. They like to think about the kindness and the mercy and the grace. Positive and encouraging. So, because of that, they stay arrogant. They're trusting in their morality or their religion or their ethnic heritage. What they're born into to make them right with God. But here we're told to consider, think about, not only the kindness, everyone loves to think about that now, the kindness of God, but think about also, meditate on His severity. That He's severe toward those who reject Him, who don't believe, who arrogantly assume that they have God taken care of. Because they think, well, I'm not so bad. God's going to be good to me. He's merciful and I'm not horrible. So they'll solve it. That they think they just deserve to belong to His olive tree. They were, after all, they're born into a Christian nation or a Christian family. They won't consider the severity of God. And so they won't stand in awe of Him. And so they're liable to be cut off by Him. Faith attaches us to the one tree. Now if we lose that faith, we will be cut off. And if Israel will but stop unbelieving, they will be grafted back in again. All they have to do is believe. Now it would be even easier for them to do so. It should be the easiest for the Jews to do so. Because their whole culture has been shaped by the Word of God, for thousands of years. Longer than ours have. It's been shaped by the laws and the Proverbs and the prophets. And so they are we call us natural branches. In other words, they're being cultivated in God's culture. And all God has to do then is to soften their heart, open their eyes, wake them up from their spiritual stupor. And they will believe. It will be easier for them to do so than for us. With our barbaric culture, gladiatorial games and child sacrifice, all that kind of stuff, still part of our culture. It's just our culture that's so naturally hostile, naturally greedy, and individualistic, or culture where family is everything, and we even worship our ancestors. That kind of culture is hard to break through. That's unnatural to come to God. Well, there's one tree into which branches are cut off and grafted in. If the branches get proud and think that they have a right to be part of the tree, the severe God breaks them off. And then the kind God, acting out of nothing but grace, takes other branches, wild and uncultivated, pagan, worshiping their ancestors, chasing after money, and connects them to the tree. And suddenly they change. So there's a remnant, a chosen people within the natural peoples chosen by grace. There is a tree, one tree made up of many branches from other trees. And finally, there is a mystery. Third, the mystery. Now, this wasn't what Israel expected. Israel expected that a Messiah would come who would lead them in triumph over all their earthly enemies. He would give them a kingdom, give it to them, to Israelites, simply because it was theirs by right, inherited by birth, by ethnicity. They're just born into it. They prayed, "Blessed are you for not making me a Gentile." They weren't expecting to be told that they had to believe to be one of God's people. They had to be born again. They thought being born the first time was good enough if you're born in the right nation. Now, they didn't expect that God had a people made out of many, into which He is making one. That was the mystery, hidden under the surface in the Old Testament. Now in the New Testament, you can go back and see hints of it all over the place in the Old Testament. It's a mystery there. It's not fully revealed, but it's there. Now it's fully out in the open in the New Testament. They certainly weren't expecting that they could be cut off. And the same thing could happen to us if we're conceited, if we allow our ethnic pride or our pride in our own works and our religion, our morality to delude us into thinking that we have God taken care of. That, well, He just must be on our side. He's our God. We inherited Him. After all, besides e pluribus unum, we put in God we trust in our money. Isn't He impressed with that? Even if in reality we're actually trusting in our money. We can be conceited if we forget the mystery. Understand the mystery, starting in verse 25 to the end of the chapter, the mystery. A partial hardening has come upon Israel. It's partial because still, from the beginning of the gospel until now, some Jews indeed are being saved, coming to believe in Jesus, but not many. This partial hardening is until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. So God is taking people from Gentile nations, and when that's done, well, there's an implication that the hardening will be over. Well, that word until may imply that a full number of non-Jewish people will come into the people of God. They will be saved to be part of the olive tree, and then Israel will no more be hardened, and then there will be a great revival among the Jews, and many of them will accept Jesus as the Messiah. That's kind of implied, hinted at, maybe. It's not clearly stated. So if you don't believe that, whatever. It's not clearly stated, but we can hope so. What it clearly says is that now Israel is partially hardened while the Lord brings in people from all kinds of other ethnic groups. People like us. From the beginning of the church, the gospel has been spreading. Now, not evenly. Not like epicenter in Jerusalem and just kind of goes out evenly in all directions. That hasn't happened that way. Sometimes it's been resisted by some nations. Some nations are hard to crack. In our day, probably the Buddhist nations are hardest, like Nepal, Bhutan, places like that, Thailand, some of the hardest to the gospel now. Then sometimes the Lord does something on a national scale and then turns the hearts of a nation to Himself. First the gospel went southwest to Ethiopia, then northwest to Turkey and to Greece, to Rome, north to Armenia. Armenia was the first nation to officially make Christianity its religion. Then into Europe. Through Europe it spread to America, and now it has been spreading both west across the Pacific to the far west. That's where East Asia is. It's actually in the far west. And south, both Africa and South America, Christianity has quadrupled in size over the last century. Some scoffers in America and Europe like to say, well, Christianity is dying. No, it's not. It's been exploding over the last century. While it appears that perhaps now Europe has been hardened and cut off, having become presumptuous and proud, thinking that they are civilization. There's this whole series about European art culture. It's called Civilization, as though they're civilization. That's just pride. And so they get cut off. You get proud, you get cut off. And now Europe has some of the highest percentages of belief in atheism. But let's not be proud. Well, that's those Europeans, not us. We're much more faithful in America. No, the same thing could happen here. It may have already begun. The part of the country that used to be the first Bible Belt. You know where the Bible Belt began? Began in New England, settled by fiery Puritans. And now that is the least Christian. Only 3% of New Englanders go to an evangelical church. I mean, it's founded to be a home for evangelical churches. And now only 3% of the people there go. And that can spread to the south. But the Lord hardens and cuts off some nations while softening and adding others. The gospel has grown enormously in South Korea and China. In 1800, there were no known Protestant Christians in all of China. 0. Now there are an estimated 40 million to as many as 150 million. If you listen to the Sunday school lesson, Piper said there's 150 million Christians there now. The first Protestant church wasn't planted in Korea until 1884, but within 100 years, there were 30,000 churches. Not 30,000 believers, 30,000 churches, and some of those churches are some of the largest in the world, but there are now being more Christians in South Korea than Buddhists, which is their traditional religion. Meanwhile, the gospel has also spread wildly in Africa. In the year 1900, there were only 9 million Christians in the whole continent of Africa, but 100 years later, in 2000, there were an estimated 380 million. Now, it may be that before Jesus returns, that every nation will have their time of being softened and grafted into the tree, producing fruit. And as the Lord reaps believers from among them, He finds His sheep in those other sheepfolds and brings them in. The mystery hidden in the past but revealed now is that Israel is now hardened. The fullness of the non-Jews, all kinds of people, and Chinese and Africans, Europeans, is coming in. The full complement of believers from all kinds of ethnic groups all over the world. And verse 26 says, and in this way, all Israel will be saved. I'm going to spend a little time on verse 26 because I don't think it means what many people assume it means. Notice that key conjunction. In this way. That connecting word. Okay, that tells you something about what he was just talking about. This process. These people coming in. Israel hardened and people coming in from different nations. It's a connecting word that explains what comes before it. Now, some assume it just means then. Like, well, then, after all that, all Israel will be saved. Well, first, is all Israel going to be saved? Like every single Israelite, every single Jew? Well, they don't mean that. Well, what do you mean? Some think it means then all Israel will be saved. That it's about a time or a sequence. And that it means first Israel is hardened and then Gentiles are saved and then there's a revival at the end of all Israel. But that's not what it says. It says so, or in this way, thus, that is through what he's just described, what we were just talking about. This first, the remnant of the Jews, they're saved, right? Most, the partial hardening, but there's still a remnant. And then there's this fullness of the Gentiles. This full number, people from every Gentile nation, they're getting saved. In this manner, all Israel will be saved through this process. So what is all Israel? All Israel is the remnant from the literal Jews combined with the believers from every nation that he is drawing. Again, you want to think of it mathematically. Let's use math terms. Remnant of the believing Jews. Plus sign. Fullness of the Gentiles. The full number of the Gentiles. Plus equals all Israel. That's the definition of all Israel. The Jewish remnant plus the believing non-Jews. Add them together, you get all Israel. In this way, God is adding to his one people, Israel, the church. Church just means assembly, the gathering. He gathers them together. What's he call this gathering? Israel. symbolized by the tree. It's a complete number of Gentiles from every ethnicity to make all Israel. Understand? I'm almost running out of different ways to say it. I'm trying to say it every single way I can, because there's a lot of misinformation about this verse. But the remnant in ethnic Israel, plus believers from every nation, in this way, out of many, become one. Pluribus Unum. So the deliverer, Christ, because of his work in Zion, will create one holy people, banishing ungodliness. He makes a covenant with them. He takes away our sins. So even though the Jews are now hardened while God gathers people from all the other nations, the Jews are still beloved. God is still saving some from the Jews. We may be tempted to scoff and think that they are disobedient to the gospel, that they refuse to believe. Well, so were we at one point. We received mercy. The kind God softened us and grafted us into his people. And now he's going around the world to every nation, bringing them in. As for the Jews in verse 28, even if many of them now are enemies of God, they are that way he says, for our sake, for your sake, to get the gospel to us. That's why God hardened them, to bring the gospel to you. They still are, the elect nation, the nation chosen out of all the world for God to work through. And that call and that gift, that can't be revoked. God's not going to undo it. God's not going to start over with a new nation. And that means that there'll always be people from them being saved. The covenants God made through them to Abraham and to David are eternal, and they're fulfilled by Christ. And that's why you ever thought about it? Why is Israel, of all the nations of the world, you read lists of nations from like 2,000-3,000 years ago. Most of them have disappeared. Some of them are hard to pronounce. Who are they? Where are they? I don't care. But Israel is one of those few that still last. Out of a handful of nations, they survived thousands of years. They're mostly unbelieving, sure. They're disobedient to the gospel. God commands them to believe. They don't. And now, so the gospel, because of that, the gospel goes to other nations. Because of verse 32, God has charged all, meaning every ethnic group, with disobedience, so that he might have mercy on everyone. Not every individual, but on every ethnic group, on every nation, by finding a remnant, chosen people, out of everyone, saving believers out of them all. That's the mystery. And that they did not expect. They expected, like a lot of us expect, that God in history is all about us. If not individually, at least nationally. About our ethnic group. The world history is about America or China or whatever. It's about us. But God's plan is much larger than any one nation or culture or race. It's about his grace and glory. The mystery, along with the severity and the mercy, should make us stand in awe. Oh, the exclamation of amazement in verse 32. Oh, the depth of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God. To make one people united by faith, one people out of many. That God could do something so much greater than just exalting one nation, just being one nation's God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. A God just for our nation, our national God. Kind of like a national emblem, national bird. We have a national God. That kind of God, bound to protect us and prosper us, our kind of people. A religion that's always in favor of our armies and our emperors or presidents. That's not remarkable. That's not astounding. It's not awe-inspiring. That's just a tribal God. Every little pagan nation has one of those. But a God who seeks out by grace people from every nation, who draws the hearts of people from every culture, from every race. That's unthinkable. Who has known the mind of the Lord? Who could have conceived it? Who would have thought of a plan like that? The reason each of us here who is truly saved has a relationship with God is because of this mystery. That God did not confine his mercy to one ethnic group, to one nation. That he planned from the beginning when he told Abraham, I will make of you a blessing to the nations. That through Christ he would attach all kinds of people to himself. Well, so now we've reached the end of this long journey from the pits of depravity. We started in Romans chapter 1, where the wrath of God is being revealed against our sin. Even the moral and the religious had no way out. Some thought that their way out was because of the nation that they were born into. That Abraham or Isaac and Jacob or David would give them a way out. But he has demolished that illusion. And he's shown it to be nothing but pride in the worst sense of the word. And God is severe to that. But he is merciful to those he chooses to have mercy on. We believe he has grace. How could we, who are attached by grace to his people, repay him for what he has done? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. What can we give a God who has everything, who has given us everything? We stand in awe.